Welcome to On the Other Hand. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I've wanted to do justice to the topic of the Book of Mormon for a while, especially for why I find it to be such compelling evidence for the existence of God and His Church on the earth today. So this video is a supercut of sorts, where I've gathered some of the best and most convincing aspects of the Book of Mormon into one place. I'll start off with part of a talk by Elder Holland.
For 179 years, this book has been examined and attacked, denied and deconstructed, targeted and torn apart, like perhaps no other book in modern religious history, perhaps like no other book in any religious history. And still it stands. Failed theories about its origins have been born, parroted, and died. From Ethan Smith to Solomon Spaulding to deranged paranoid to cunning genius. None of these frankly pathetic answers for this book has ever withstood examination, because there is no other answer than the one Joseph gave as its young, unlearned translator.
Now, Elder Holland came out swinging in this general conference talk, so let me take some clips from some of the best deep dives into the Book of Mormon I found. You might notice that this is a very long video, but that's because it's a very interesting and detailed subject I intend to do justice to. Most often I can only get a single point into a reasonably short video, but the Book of Mormon has been the subject of some very interesting and in-depth scholarship and research, and I don't want to short sell all that work by just summarizing their conclusions. Also note that most of these arguments aren't the main reasons I believe the Book of Mormon to be the Word of God, but they do present convincing and compelling arguments to why I think more people should look into the doctrine and claims of the Book of Mormon rather than dismissing it offhandedly. If one doesn't want to get involved in the subject, I can respect that to an extent. But if you want to talk about and understand some of the reasons that such a crazy-sounding origin story for this religion has held up for so long, I invite you to buckle up and enjoy. And if you're only marginally interested in this video, I would suggest skipping to the last of these segments about the logic tree of the Book of Mormon, as I find that to be the most concise and compelling, but the groundwork for that argument is laid in the previous sections I have here, so that single argument on its own might not seem as thorough if you do end up skipping. Anyway, for everyone else, let's dive in. First, I want to go over a deep dive into the most common sources and origins for the Book of Mormon that are argued, if it wasn't given from God by revelation. This comes from a fair talk in 2019.
When we talk about the Book of Mormon, I think everyone here knows we're talking about a big book with a lot of moving parts, if you will. And Joseph Smith, and one thing I want to point out is that it's written to about an 8th grade reading level. And there's lots of algorithms that people will put books into. And it comes out at least at an 8th grade level, or some of the algorithms say it's even more complex than that and should be even college level. If you're interested in this material, I refer you to this article in Interpreter, and I love Interpreter, grateful to Dan and all of his crew for their work in allowing this article, but it talks about how you calculate the reading level of the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith said he received the words of the Book of Mormon through supernatural influences. But just as soon as he was making this claim, the people around him, critics, who are always with us and always will be, at least until the Lord comes again, they were saying, no, this is natural. The Book of Mormon came through natural means. And things were being published even before the Book of Mormon was printed, saying these things, giving this message. It came through natural efforts. And then if you fast forward to the last few decades, there have been dozens, if not hundreds of books with the message that Joseph Smith was able to produce the Book of Mormon through natural means. It's interesting to me how many of these publications come from signature books, but that's just kind of a side discussion. I think the most prominent two are Fawn Brody's book and my friend Dan Vogel's book that champion this idea that the Book of Mormon came through natural means. And so what I've done the last 4 years is created a database. And quickly, see if you can read fast, I'm just kidding. But I just wanted to demonstrate that it's got about 65,000 words in it, but I've taken excerpts from 170 plus secular sources telling how Joseph was able to create all those words. And if we chart these, we find there's really 5 predominant theories. There's the Solomon Spaulding theory, collaboration with someone, mental illness, automatic writing, and then Joseph's intellect. And if we look at them over chronologically, notice the far right column. That's Joseph Smith's intellect. Originally, Joseph is dumb. The Book of Mormon is dumb. So that's how it was produced. But look at the first column, Solomon Spaulding. In 1834, it's introduced, and then everybody is jumping on this bandwagon for the next 50 years. And then something happens, and then there's this smattering of ideas, and people aren't sure exactly. And then, again, things start to shift over to the Joseph Smith's intellect. His brain was sufficient to do it, and that's by far and away the most predominant theory today. If we track these graphically this way, we see the dark purple is Joseph Smith's intellect. That's at the beginning, and then we see it predominating at the end. There's the pink there for the Solomon Spaulding theory. So what we're going to do is talk about these 5 theories. These are the most predominant ones from the naturalists, explaining where Joseph got all of the words. Now, the Spaulding theory begins in 1812 with Solomon Spaulding writing a manuscript. And we call it manuscript story. It has different names sometimes depending upon who you're reading. But he shares this manuscript with his neighbors. He reads it to them, or he lets them use it. They borrow it and read it. He dies 4 years later. And according to this theory, the manuscript was then passed to Sidney Rigdon, who added some of the religious elements, and then it was passed to Joseph Smith, who secretly put it into the translation process. Well, the Book of Mormon is published in 1830, and some of the people who are reading the Book of Mormon are the same people that Spaulding had shared his manuscript with back in 1812. And they're starting to say, hey, these are the same people in the same places in the Book of Mormon that I remember Solomon Spaulding had in his manuscript. And this theory was published in 1834 by E.D. Howe, and it just took off like wildfire. It just predominates almost everybody's theories for at least 50 years. But then in 1884, they find the copy, and they discover some things about it that make people less sure that there's an actual connection between the Spaulding manuscript and the Book of Mormon. So the reasons why Spaulding theory is not really widely accepted today, and it really isn't, it comes in at 50,840 words, which is less than a fifth the size of the Book of Mormon. So even if Joseph plagiarized every word, he'd really have to come up with a lot of words on his own. The overall writing style and composition are vastly different. There's no identical or similar names of people and places. And there's just no documentation that Sidney Rigdon had ever met Spaulding or was aware of his manuscript. And then there's a problem with any theory that says that Joseph had a pre-existing manuscript. How did he get that into the translation process? We have friendly and unfriendly people telling us Joseph put his head in a hat and dictated. There were no other manuscripts around. And so if he had a manuscript, did he memorize it the night before? Did he sneak it into the hat? I mean, it's a problem that is not just for this particular theory. Now, the second theory from the database is collaborators, independent of the Spaulding manuscript. And Oliver Cowdery is one of the most common ones. Roger Anderson in his book, and more recently Richard Van Wagner's book, both posit that Joseph and Oliver together wrote the Book of Mormon, and that they had the skills to do it. Another common one is Sidney Rigdon, because he was really the smartest one of the group there, of the early saints probably, and people will say he must have done it somehow and slipped it to Joseph Smith. I added this one because it's just fascinating to me. It's almost a 500-page book. The theory is that Joseph Smith Sr. wrote the Book of Mormon and then used Joseph Smith Jr. as the front man. Now, the reasons why the collaborator theory is not more widely accepted, the supportive arguments are primarily speculative. There's just isn't any credible corroborative historical documentation. And then you've got to ask the question, particularly if Sidney Rigdon were involved or someone, but why would anyone put in all of that work without eventually demanding some of the credit? So the collaborator theory is out there, never been that popular. The third theory, and then we're back to the how does he get a manuscript into it. The third theory is mental illness. And it's obviously a retrospective diagnosis. There was nobody in Nauvoo, visitors, who came in and said, Joseph, I think you're schizophrenic. I mean, they didn't have that language. They didn't have the diagnostic abilities then. But we find in 1903, I. Woodbridge Riley said Joseph had epilepsy, and that was helping him with some of the visions and things. That Bernard Devoto in 1930 said he had a paranoid personality disorder. There's Harry Beardsley, dementia praecox. I don't know if the button or the battery is dead in this. There we go. Kimball Young, parapath. Klaus Hansen, schizophrenia. And Klaus Hansen backed away from that after a while. Larry Foster, bipolar disorder. And Larry's actually changed from that too. I met him at MHA. He said he has another theory now. Bill Moraine, dissociation. Robert Anderson, narcissistic personality disorder. But all of the problems with this is that psychoanalysis of dead people is an inexact science. Dr. Roy Grinker, he said this, Freud started the fashion of analyzing writers as well as historical characters such as Shakespeare, Leonardo da Vinci, and even Moses. Many of his students have followed this pattern in writing, often brilliantly, imaginative interpretations of the neuroses and psychoses of authors, playwrights, and artists, which are based on a minimum of evidence. Psychoanalytic theory carried to excess or based on biased reports of the life histories of authors becomes ridiculous. A second reason, with respect to mental illness, narcissism could give someone more confidence in themselves, and a manic phase of bipolar disease could amplify a person's energy. And if you've ever seen anybody in that, it's remarkable, their energy. But mental illness will always diminish a person's cognitive abilities to perform complex functions. If this were not so, psychiatric hospitals would be teeming with all of these amazingly creative works of artists and books and things, and we just don't see it. It's just the opposite of that. Automatic writing. This is a fun topic, and I would refer you to the current issue of Dialogue. I have an article in there that has much more details than I'm able to present here today. But automatic writing is a term used to designate writing that is done without the writer being conscious of what he is writing. A person who writes automatically is usually in some altered state of consciousness. And before psychology got involved, there was spirit writing, trance writing, channeling, and these things have been known for hundreds of years. And these are words that could be spoken. These are words that could be produced with a planchette that has a pencil or a pen on it, and you just move it around a paper. There's Ouija boards, which also could produce words fairly rapidly, as a matter of fact. Now, the characteristics of automatic writing is that there's no pre-writing and there's no rewriting. In other words, if you go to a college campus and learn about creative writing, we're going to learn there's three basic stages. You pre-write, you get your notes, you get quotations, grab the books you're going to use, and an outline, and then you write that first draft, and then you rewrite the draft, and you rewrite the draft, and you rewrite the draft, and you revise it, and you cut and paste, and you copy edit, and you content edit, and all of these things. But with automatic writing, you just write. The words are produced, and then they are usually published with very little change. Sorry about this really busy slide. It's reproduced in the article and dialogue, which you can download for free as a PDF. But the first column, and what I've done here is tried to accumulate every automatic writer who has produced a long manuscript. And the first column is the name of the most popular of their manuscripts, the date it was published, the name of the author, the birth date of the author, the education of the author, the number of words, and then the last column is where did all of the words come from according to that individual. And one thing that we'll notice is that there's a breakdown in the education of the automatic writer versus the complexity of the book or essay that they're writing. Very complex texts are being written by people with minimal education, and if we go back to the chart, and I don't know if you can see there, but I've highlighted that column, we can see that some of these people have PhDs, or they're dentists or doctors, so they're smart. That doesn't necessarily mean they can write books, but they are educated. But several of the people really have minimal education, but they're creating long, complex texts. A third characteristic is that all of these authors attribute the words to some force outside of themselves. If you ask them, where'd the words come from? Did you make them up? None of them would say they came from me or I composed this text. They always attribute it to someone else. And again, if you look at that last column, you can see that they're in a trance state, or they're talking to Jehovah, or they're getting it from Akashic records, or from someone named Seth, or a spirit guide, or something like this. But they aren't claiming credit for these writings. The most common, and I apologize, the Joseph and the Book of Mormon are at the bottom of that slide and it's cut off, but the most common book, automatic writing that's compared to the Book of Mormon is called The Sorry Tale by Pearl Curran. The Sorry Tale was published in 1917. It has 264,000 words. It was communicated through the spirit of a deceased woman named Patience Worth, who said she had lived in England in the 1600s. It came through a Ouija board, although Pearl Curran eventually got rid of the Ouija board, didn't need it anymore, and before her death, Curran had communicated over 4 million words from this deceased person, Patience Worth. And the book, The Sorry Tale, is just one of several books that Pearl Curran composed. If we compare The Sorry Tale and Joseph Smith to Pearl Curran and The Sorry Tale, there are a number of undeniable similarities. The authors had minimal education, there was no pre-writing and no rewriting, there was just dictation. The word counts are similar, there's similar complexity. Actually, I think the Book of Mormon is more complex, but the dictation sessions were of similar length, and they would start where they previously ended the dictation. They didn't go back and review or anything to start again. There was no editing, it went straight to the printer, and then both used an instrument. Joseph, the seer stone, and Pearl Curran used the Ouija board. The naturalistic explanation for automatic writings is intriguing. It starts by talking about what we think with, and this is mostly stuff that was published by Freud. But he says our minds are made up of our conscious thoughts and then preconscious. Preconscious being things we can immediately call up, as if I asked you, what was your first elementary school? You could probably remember that name, but it wasn't on the stage of your mind before I asked it. But then there's an unconscious portion of our minds that's made up of all kinds of feelings and memories and knowledge elements. And through automatic writing, those unconscious elements are brought into consciousness. And therapists will sometimes hypnotize their clients, their patients, and have them write in a trance. And sometimes they can use whatever is written to help them improve their mental health. This has been re-emphasized to us recently by Dr. Ann Taves in her book, Revelatory Events. And she theorizes in this book, and it was just published in 2016, that Joseph Smith would see the seer stone, and that would trigger a kind of a formal hypnotic induction. She called it an imaginative storytelling mode, a visual modality, or a highly focused awareness. And once Joseph entered into this state, he was able to automate and effortlessly dictate the Book of Mormon. I talk a lot more about this in the article if if you look at that. Now, the reasons why automatic writing is not more popular among the secularists is that hypnosis does not transform a person into someone with greater creativity, memory, or cognitive function. That just doesn't happen. I'm going to give you just a few examples. Psychologist John F. Kielstrom, he wrote, "Hypnosis appears to be incapable of enhancing memory, but hypnotic procedures can impair memory." And sometimes what will happen, and Dr. Taves and Scott Dunn, who's written on this, will say that somebody under hypnosis remembered something that happened when they were 5 years old, that they didn't know that they could remember, and so therefore Joseph Smith could systematize all the memory needed to create the Book of Mormon. There's kind of a leap there, but the memory doesn't work that way in a trance state. John A. Barge and Ezekiel Mosea of Yale said, although concept activation and primitive associated learning could occur unconsciously, anything complex requiring flexible responding, integration of stimuli, or higher mental processes could not. And then one other example, hypnosis does not appear to bolster creativity relative to non-hypnotic conditions. And I've reviewed hundreds of articles and read dozens. You just can't go into a trance state and suddenly become a super author or a super anything, actually. It doesn't increase your abilities. So a second problem with the automatic writing theory is that explaining an alleged supernatural activity with another alleged supernatural activity does not result in a naturalistic explanation. And we see critics will sometimes refer to the sorry tale in Pearl Quran and say, see, I've explained how Joseph did it. Well, not really. Okay, what they need is a naturalistic explanation for one of the processes, and then maybe they could apply it to both. Joseph Smith's intellect theory. This is the funnest one of all. We notice that it is the most popular today. There's very few people seriously promoting any other theory to explain how Joseph Smith generated all of those words. The problem with all of these theorists, all of the advocates, is they treat Joseph like a black box. What is a black box? Well, a black box talks about inputs and outputs. It doesn't talk about what's going on inside of the box. And when we applied this to Joseph Smith, what we find among the critics is that they focus on the input. They say he plagiarized the King James Bible. He borrowed from View of the Hebrews. He grabbed parallel phrases from a whole host of books, or he grabbed things from his environment. They will also attack the output of the book. Archaeology disproves the Book of Mormon. Indian DNA disproves the Book of Mormon. There are anachronisms and all kinds of changes, according to Gerald Tanner. And then in linguistics, disprove it. And then what happens with most of the advocates of this theory is that they talk about these things in yellow as if they're explaining how Joseph Smith generated all of the words. I'm not even sure that they really recognize the fact that talking about the input and the output doesn't explain how Joseph was able to mentally create the Book of Mormon text. They ignore what's going on inside. So the question comes up, well, how would you open the box? I mean, that's a tall order. How do you look inside somebody's brain, especially when this happened in 1829? Well, I would offer two suggestions. One is that we identify the cognitive skill set that Joseph Smith would have needed to dictate the Book of Mormon, and then we simply demonstrate that he possessed most of those abilities. You can ask, well, what does it take to create the Book of Mormon like Joseph did? Well, we don't have studies on creative dictation, but we do have lots of studies on creative writing of long essays and long books. And there are people who have spent a great deal of time asking writers to think about what they're thinking as they're writing. And they've taken this research and they've compiled different models. And this one by Linda Flowers and John Hayes is the most popular. It was done in 1981. Again, it's for creative writing. But what they came up with is this model here. So what they've tried to do is figure out what's going on in a writer's mind as they're writing all of the sentences that become a large book. It starts with what they call the rhetorical problem, but this is really the motivation. What would motivate somebody to write a book? What is the issue that they're trying to address? In this model, the long-term memory actually included things outside of the brain of the writer. They were allowed to have books and articles and notes and outlines and things. And then we have what's going on inside the mind of the individual, and there's different boxes there that you can see, and they define these. And just basically, we've got the planning box, which is where there's organization of the first attempts to create the words that eventually will go into the text. There's a section that is constantly reviewing what's going on and what they're about to say or write in the text, and then it all comes together in what they call the translating stage. And that becomes the words produced so far. Now, the question is, and I should point out, this is important, that there is a feedback loop. In other words, what they write is not the final draft. They can rewrite. So there's a cycle there. They write and then they revise, and then they write and they revise until they get to the final. Now, the question is, could we modify this creative writing model to apply to creative dictation, which is what the intellect theory says Joseph used to create all of the words? This is my version, and I welcome people to modify it or start from scratch. But I've had to make a few changes in the Flower-Hayes model in order to apply it to somebody who's dictating and not writing. First, everything goes into the mind. And that's a rhetorical problem, but it's also everything from memory. Joseph used no manuscripts or books, so anything he was going to recall to be in the Book of Mormon, he had to preload into his brain. And the intellect theory posits that Joseph had like 7 years of district schooling. He'd visited bookstores and libraries. He had been memorizing the Bible and scrutinizing View of the Hebrews and The Last War and Napoleon's First Book and a whole bunch of other books, and that he'd been going to all kinds of camp meetings and religious revivals. And my friend Mike Quinn would say he'd been reading lots of books on magic too. I mean, he was a busy guy according to this theory. The problem is there's just no credible evidence to support that Joseph was doing any of these things. He probably had a third-grade education, but these other things, there's just no documentation for it, and there's actually contradictory evidences in several cases. We also find that the midterm and short-term memory, when you're dictating a book, is highly taxed, highly burdened. Flower and Hayes said each word in the growing text determines and limits the choices of what can come next. And it also taxes short-term memory. And so you're wordsmithing a current sentence, lexical choices, syntactical choices, but you also have to remember the very last sentence. So it'll be coherent. So the memory is really burdened throughout this process. And then notice this arrow. It goes one way. Once you dictate the sentence, you're done. So that's nice. But you got to make sure it's right the first time, or else you're going to have a problem. There's no reviewing allowed. So this just demonstrates the draft one is the final draft, but with creative writing, you can have multiple drafts and revisions. What happens if we apply this model to Joseph Smith? Well, the motivation, what would motivate Joseph to fabricate the Book of Mormon is somewhat controversial. We have people saying, like Dan Vogel, that he was a kind deceiver, and he was sincere, and he wanted to do good, and he was willing to lie to do it. But most, by far, the vast majority of the secularists will refer to Joseph as simply wanting power or money and followers. And so there's some controversy there, and you still have to ask, what would make somebody who wanted power or money choose to write a very long book and carry on the ruse of looking in a hat at a stone for 57 days or 84 days or whatever the number is? It doesn't naturally flow, in my mind. Now, he probably had a third-grade education, despite an article that says he may have had more. I won't talk about that, but he probably was about our third-grade level. His experiences were quite limited. Farmer, age 23, he did go to the coast after his operation on his knee, but we have Orsimus Turner, who said that Joseph did participate in a debate club occasionally, and that he was a passable Methodist exhorter, but Turner also said he was below average intellect. So again, not finding a lot of extensive experiences. We mentioned research-wise, there's no one reporting that he was going to bookstores and libraries in the area to review things in anticipation of the book. Creativity, we do have that one quote from Lucy Mack Smith that at times he would give recitals and talk about the book, the early inhabitants of America and the animals that they rode on and things of this nature. So he definitely had some creativity looking at it from the intellect theory's viewpoint. The mid and the short-term memory, long-term memory of Joseph is difficult to assess, but we can look to 1835 when he was learning Hebrew from Joshua Seixas. He was not the star student. He didn't manifest a photographic memory. In fact, Orson Pratt received a certificate saying, "You can teach Hebrew." Joseph's certificate from Seixas said, "If you continue, you will become proficient." Okay, that's not much of an endorsement, really. But that's all that Joseph got from Seixas. So even Joseph wasn't dumb, and I'm not saying that at all, but we're not finding a super intelligent level of cognitive function in the historical record, and admittedly it's not as complete as we would like. Joseph had no reputation as a preacher prior to dictating the Book of Mormon, no reputation as a storyteller, improv. So as I apply the historical record to the model that I've created, I don't find a real convincing set of evidence that Joseph would have been able to do this. Now, I'm obviously biased. I'm here. I'm a believer. And the critics are more than welcome to modify this and to point out any weaknesses. Now, a second way to open this black box would be to design a study to duplicate what Joseph Smith did. Now, it'd be kind of a hassle. You'd have to tie up several people for 2 or 3 months' time. But guess what? We don't have to do that. Almost anybody in this audience can replicate Joseph's efforts, or at least attempt to, with this right here. We don't need Oliver Cowdery. We can use the voice-to-text app in our phones. And all you have to do is dictate a text message. Now, it needs to be about 20 to 30 words at least. And before you dictate this text message, or before you hit the send button, correct the grammar, correct the spelling. Joseph went back and did this afterwards. And then you just have somebody receive the text message and line them up one right after another on the other end. And then you just do this over and over, and over, and over, and over, and over, and over, until you've done it about 10,000 times. Or until you have 269,320 words. Now, there are some restrictions if you want to emulate Joseph Smith's efforts. First off, you cannot rearrange a single sentence or text block after you hit send. And there's a lot of remarkable characteristics about the initial stream of words that Joseph Smith spoke to his scribes. But to me, this is one of the easiest to identify and talk about, because anybody who's written a 3-paragraph email knows that rearranging sentences is a real common phenomenon. And for Joseph Smith to have dictated nearly 7,000 sentences without rearranging a single one is a remarkable phenomenon. And these were long sentences. If we compare the sentence length of the Book of Mormon to other fictional works, it's 2 to 3 times the sentence length. And it also is interesting, if he's dictating text blocks of 20 to 30 words and the average sentence length is 40, he's dictating partial sentences each time. And I don't think that would have made it any easier. You have to dictate without punctuation, and you might think that would make it easier, but BYU professor Roger Terry said Joseph Smith's task stretches far beyond his ability to convert pre-language concepts into lengthy and layered sentence structures of the Book of Mormon. Without the guidance of punctuation to separate embedded clauses, this feat would have been mind-boggling. And the importance of commas cannot be understated. The Book of Mormon has almost 25,000 commas and almost 6,000 semicolons that were added by John H. Gilbert, who typeset the text. And my dear wife, my sweet companion, who works as a professional editor, said she'd be charging about $50 an hour to be putting all these commas in this text. It would be a challenge. But you have to dictate without any punctuation. And of course, you have to use an alternate dialect or vernacular, and we're all grateful to Royal Skousen and Stan Carmack, who have looked at how Joseph dictated the Book of Mormon using a dialect that was not upstate New York. He's not dictating in his everyday verbiage. He's choosing to do it in something else. So you can choose early English, you can choose jive. I don't care what vernacular you want to choose, but if you want to replicate Joseph, choose something that is not your everyday speech. You also need to not use words, specific words, that that you use in your everyday speech. There was a letter written by Joseph just weeks after the translation was finished. And in this letter, he closes it by saying, "Now may God receive us all to rest with him in eternal repose through the atonement of Christ our Lord." The word repose does not appear in the Book of Mormon. The words peace or rest do, but this is the first word apparently he chose for that application when he's writing a letter just weeks after he's finished the translation of the Book of Mormon, where he never used the word once. Another example, this is a letter written a year after the Book of Mormon is published. It's written from Kirtland by Joseph to his brother Hiram. He says, "I have been engaged in regulating the churches here, as the disciples are numerous, and the devil has made many attempts to overthrow them. It has been a serious job, but the Lord is with us, and we have overcome and have all things regular." The word job does not appear in the Book of Mormon. The word labor in some form is there almost 100 times. Likewise, all things are mentioned many times in the Book of Mormon, but they are never listed as being regular. So we see evidence that Joseph is doing this dictation, but he's not using everyday speech. I want to just suggest that for those that are advocates of the intellect theory, there's an elephant in the room. And I don't mean for this to be in any way disrespectful or snarky, but it's like one will say, Joseph could do this naturally. And everybody seems to want to agree. But this elephant in the room that nobody to date has talked about is the difficulty of creative dictation. The ability that, according to this theory, Joseph did. He was able to dictate all of these sentences in all their complexity without having to go back and do any content editing of any kind. To be honest with you, and this is a criticism of this theory, it seems the intellect theory is not really a theory at all. It's just an assumption. If Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon naturally, the process, I think, ought to be understandable and repeatable. Now we're going to shift gears just a little bit, because the intellect theory allows us to compare Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon to other authors and their books. Busy chart, I apologize, and I'm going over, so I'm going to go quickly, but what I've done here is accumulated every author under the age of 24 to publish a long book. And if you restack the evidence, we discover the Book of Mormon is 50% longer than the next longest book. If we look at the difficulty of the text, the Book of Mormon is at an 8th grade level. All of these are simpler than that. And then if we look at the education of the authors, they all have more education than Joseph, except perhaps the one on the top, Mary Shelley. And then it's interesting that there were only 3 young authors before Joseph Smith. And they wrote books that were simpler and much shorter. If we compare Joseph and his word count output, number of words he produced, we see the Book of Mormon at age 23. We see a little blip for the Joseph Smith translation, Book of Moses, Book of Abraham. If we compare him to other authors, Tolkien is probably the most common. We find Tolkien wrote his book way late in life. If we compare Joseph to Shakespeare, which they do on Mormon Think, we find that Shakespeare was very constant. He wrote a play every year, sometimes 2, except for 1 year. But by the age that Shakespeare completed his first play, Joseph had completed 85% of everything he was going to produce. I had to include J.K. Rowling because I just love those movies. Again, we see a difference. It's later. There's some crescendo there in the publication. Joseph just pops out as being somewhat unique. Now, I'll be honest with you. I've studied these for 4 years, these theories. I don't think any of them are plausible. But again, I admit my biases right up front. I've been accused of trying to prove the Book of Mormon is true. I'm not doing that either. We don't prove supernatural phenomena through natural evidences. But God observed that the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and he describes that in D&C 27 through 10, is proving to the world that the Holy Scriptures are true and that God does inspire men. The word proving here is not mine. Of course, the world will not accept the proof. All naturalistic theories portray Joseph as a deceiver. This is one of the problems with the naturalistic theories, is that in every one, Joseph is a deceiver. He's doing the head in the hat as a ruse. Deceivers are all actors. And the Book of Mormon, however, is much more than a stage prop. In other words, actors don't write books, authors write books. So the Joseph the Deceiver theory kind of breaks down in the Book of Mormon because an actor wouldn't be expected to do that. It would take a real author, which is what Joseph has apparently done in authoring the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is the real thing. I would just close by saying that it seems that the heaven touched the earth in the creation of the Book of Mormon. At least that's my theory.
I really appreciate the deep dive into different theories of the origin for the Book of Mormon, and I find the alternative theories to be just that, theories without a whole lot to back them up. Now I want to jump into another in-depth clip from a different fair talk that presents the research of different language style markers and how that relates to the many different authors that the abridged record of the Book of Mormon presents.
You know, whenever you read a text, often you read that and you say, you know, there's a familiar ring to that. It sounds like maybe Mark Twain might have written that, or perhaps it was written by Ernest Hemingway. Or when you read these words, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. You know that those are the words of Robert Frost. Iconic words in all of the English language are those right there, and you know who the author is simply by reading those words. We work in an area of research called stylometry. Stylometry is simply a statistical way of measuring an author's style. We can answer questions like, who wrote that text? Or whose style is this the most familiar to? Who's similar to this in their writing habits? Because we deal with a fundamental premise that all authors have a writing style. They have a habit of forming expressions where they use identifiable words and phrases and a profile of frequency that is unique to them and the way they form their thoughts. This is conscious and more often unconscious expressions. The style markers that we use are what are called function words. In the language, English language, there's about 300 function words. There are words like the, which is the most common word, and, but, with, without, and so on. Now, when you hear those words, you don't know what the speaker might be referring to, so we call those non-contextual words. But they do form the structure that the speaker, the writer, is using to make their expression and deliver their message. Let me show you how this works. If we have a list of function words on the left-hand side, and we have a text of unknown authorship in red, we can look at the frequency with which those function words are used in the text. The word a is used 10 times. The word and is used 8 times. The is used 21 times, and so on. A profile of word frequencies. We take a candidate author and we compare his or her frequency of the use of those same words and see if they're similar. If we look down the list of the green words for the green author, 5 is not very close to 10. 2 is not close to 8, and so on. But on the other hand, author B, his or her profile matches more closely the word profile frequencies for those function words in the unknown text. And so B is probably a more likely candidate for the writer of the words in the unknown text. The statistical technique that we use is called discriminant analysis. We want to discriminate between things. We want to be able to classify objects. And so we look for those things that are similar, but also those things are different. Now, I'm sure you've played this game before, where you have 2 pictures, and you ask the question, where are the differences? And when you look at them, they look very similar, but there are distinct places where they are different. So what we do is we compare the features that best separate those things that might otherwise look very similar. And there are the distinguishing features. And then we take and we order those in sequential order from most distinguishing to least distinguishing. And then we have a set of features that can discriminate between one text and another. Mathematically, we create what are called linear combinations of those features. We simply add them together in a way that will show where the separations lie, so that we can then visualize graphically where the distinctions might be. We have a plot that might look like this. We would have one text that would be in yellow and another text would be in blue, and we can look along the axes to see where the differences lie. Now, in stylometry, we use these most frequent words, the frequency of the words, to make the distinctions. So we count up how many times does an author use these distinguishing words? How do the authors compare? A classic example of this technique was with the Federalist Papers. The problem was this: the Federalist Papers were written between 1787 and 1788 and published in New York City newspapers, encouraging the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. There were 85 in total, and they were published anonymously under the name of Publius, which means the Federalist. Of those 85, though, 12 of the papers were of disputed authorship, although we knew that Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay wrote all 85 of them in some sequence. The authors were dead. And Hamilton and Madison had very similar writing styles. So distinguishing the 73 known authorship and the 12 disputed authorships was quite a statistical problem. Mosteller and Wallace in 1964 undertook the challenge of seeing if statistics could be used in the way that I've described to identify who the unknown authors might be. One of the things that they found was that Hamilton preferred to use the word while and used the word upon very frequently. Madison, in comparison, preferred to use whilst instead of while, and didn't use upon hardly at all. So those were distinguishing style markers that could be used to identify who might have written the 12 disputed papers. And it turns out that the styles in the disputed papers are far closer to Madison than to Hamilton. In 1980, three researchers at BYU, Wayne Larson, Al Rincher, and Tim Layton, undertook to, inspired by Mosteller and Wallace, apply these techniques to the Book of Mormon. They used non-contextual words, looking at the frequencies throughout the Book of Mormon for evidences to see if there's multiple authors throughout the Book of Mormon, as is claimed by the text. They also noted that Joseph Smith's style did not match any of the styles within the Book of Mormon. And they actually coined the phrase word print analysis as a play on words for fingerprint to describe this approach. And this is a graph that they produced in 1980 showing the distinctions between Mormon on the right-hand side in black, Nephi on the left-hand side in green, Alma in red above them, with Moroni in between. Quite interestingly, Moroni is close to his father, Mormon. But Joseph Smith, in blue, is unlike any of the Book of Mormon speakers. Another approach was taken by John Hilton at the University of California, Berkeley, and then at BYU. He came up with the same conclusions. Although he used a different methodology, his methodology was verified when the FBI asked him to examine the manifesto from the Unabomber to see if it matched the writing style of one of their suspects. They were very disappointed when he told them that the styles did not match, but his methodology was verified when they later discovered that he was right and they were wrong, and their suspect was not the real Unabomber. Let's see if this video will play. Here's John Hilton.
Here's the way we statisticians like to display a great amount of information. It's called principal component analysis. It's a way of trying to put most of the variables that we're going to measure in all of my 65 word prints, put them into 2 or 3 or 4 dimensions so we can get a grasp of it. I plotted what the computer prints out here for us in 3 dimensions. 4 you can't see. Now, you'll notice here that Joseph Smith, the little red one, we see that he clusters very tightly. Now, the clustering means that, well, he's writing the same way. Statistically, he looks like himself. And so this is the within author checking to see how good he is. The little red one down here represents Joseph Smith when he wrote letters to Emma and to the church, his own handwriting material, together with Joseph Smith tells his own story that we publish in the document, in the library. That's what I was trying to say. Okay, now then we compare that with Oliver Cowdery, who sometimes is accused of having written the Book of Mormon, you know. We compare it against Oliver Cowdery's own writings. Oliver Cowdery did a great deal of it, so we've got a lot of examples of his own writing. He clusters very much off across the page here from Joseph Smith, and therefore they're completely different writings. We aren't surprised. Then let's look at what happens when we do the Book of Mormon. Now, this is, of course, assuming that the Book of Mormon was an invention of the 19th century type of English language, as some people might speculate. And if so, we find that Alma sits completely independent of both Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, and that Nephi, see, we had almost 20,000 words of Alma, and we have 15,000 words of Nephi, which can be directly compared. But we find that they're completely on the other part of the probability curve of where this kind of an author stands. So, what this has done is it's completely negated the hypothesis on which this study was made. That is, that it was all a 19th century type of an English production by somebody. It certainly wasn't by Joseph Smith, and it certainly wasn't by Oliver Cowdery, but it turns out that it wasn't by anybody, because there are at least the two independent ones that we see there.
I thought it was quite clever of Brother Hilton to make that three-dimensional model to show the relationships of the speakers in the Book of Mormon. Well, that was 40 years ago. Most of that was done by counting things by hand. But today we have vastly more powerful computers that we can use. We have more sophisticated statistical analysis that we can use, and far better graphical techniques. And with these, we can answer more questions. Questions like, can authors actually create distinctive styles for fictional characters? Let's take a look at some 19th century novelists.
My name is Scout Callens, and this is what we did. We took 4 19th century novelists, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, James Fenimore Cooper, and Mark Twain, and we examined 2 books by each author, and every character in their books that contained more than 500 words. And we did a stylometric analysis, as Dr. Fields was explaining, using the principal components, and we see that each author has certain plots. Now, these represent the various characters in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. From the principal components, you can see that the characters that Jane Austen is able to create are distinct from one another. Elizabeth Bennet, different from Mr. Darcy. And the plots for the other authors follow the same pattern. Charles Dickens, 2 of his most popular books. A lot of these books are ones that you would have read in high school or college in English class. Easy to tell when you're reading them that distinct characters are speaking, and the analysis.
To me, this is really cool. I find it quite interesting that Joseph Smith could have done a better job writing distinct character voices than contemporary professional authors. But next, I want to get a bit more into the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, both the original gold plates and witnesses to the divine nature and translation process of this book of Scripture.
On the 29th of March, 1830, a young Baptist minister named David Marks attended a meeting in Fayette, New York, at the house of Mr. Whitmer. That would, of course, be the home of Peter Whitmer Sr. and his wife Mary, where just 1 week later, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would be formally organized. Writing thereafter, Reverend Marks remembered that 2 or 3 of the Whitmer sons were among 8 who said they were witnesses. Actually, there were 4. Christian Whitmer, Jacob Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Jr., and John Whitmer, along with a Whitmer son-in-law, Hiram Page. The other 3 were Joseph Smith Sr., his eldest surviving son, Hiram Smith, and Samuel H. Smith, the prophet Joseph's immediately younger brother. Reverend Marks reported that they had seen certain plates of metal having the appearance of gold. These 8, we understand, were in company with Smith and 3 others. Now, the 3 others were pretty plainly the 3 witnesses: Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, yet another son of Peter and Mary, and Martin Harris. Altogether, with Joseph Smith, the witnesses totaled 12. I doubt that number is mere coincidence. Although it was nowhere enshrined in the U.S. Constitution that juries must contain 12 members, and although some American states permit lower numbers of jurors in some cases, the tradition of 12-member juries has been common, if not dominant, among English-speaking peoples, and particularly in the United States, for many generations. The origin of this customary practice goes back at least to the Welsh king Morgan of Glamorgan, who decided upon the number when he established trial by jury in AD 725, comparing the judge and jury to Jesus and his 12 apostles. The notion that important legal judgments were to be rendered by 12 good men and true, that phrase can be traced to at least the first half of the 1600s, was well established, as was the concept of a jury of one's peers, which can be traced to the Magna Carta of 1215. Along the way, in what follows, I'll briefly try to illustrate how those phrases, too, shed light on the witnesses to the Book of Mormon. As is usually done, let's consider the three witnesses first. My theme in this presentation centers on variety and complexity. So how, if at all, do the three witnesses embody that theme? In the course of that 2-day interview with us about a year before his death, Richard Anderson emphasized the differences between Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris, viewing them as representative human types. I'm quoting, "You've got Oliver Cowdery, who is trained in education equivalently to today, and he's a white-collar man, and he's a thinker, an analyzer. Now, if you wanted to get the best three representatives of the human race, you certainly include him. But he's in the minority even today. David Whitmer is a tradesman. He's a businessman. He ran a business for 50 years and kept his profits in the black instead of in the red. And then there's Martin Harris, and he's the religious fanatic, using the terminology of some people who knew him. They have a hard time with Martin Harris because he is a believer, and sometimes he believes in too much, maybe things that we wouldn't now. And Martin Harris gets criticized for being a true believer, but that's part of the logic of having three witnesses who are representative of the human race. So you've got somebody who's what you would call an intellectual, somebody who's a pragmatic businessman, and somebody that is a true believer. So the very selection of these men as witnesses, to me, is faith-promoting as a historian. The three witnesses were, in fact, a cross-section of their community," end quote. And thus, in the terms with which I began to frame this discussion, they were part of a jury of peers, and the differences between them can be argued as ensuring that. According to David Whitmer, their encounter with the angel and the plates took place toward the end of June 1829 at about 11 a.m. What was the nature of that encounter? What did these three very different men claim to have seen and heard? They saw the plates. The audible voice of God declared to them that the plates had been translated by divine gift and power. They saw the engravings on the plates. They saw an angel who had descended from heaven. The voice of God commanded them to bear record of their experience. Now, the supernaturalism of the claimed experience of the three witnesses, for lack of a better word, is absolutely clear. They didn't simply go into the woods and see an unusual metal object. They saw an angel. They heard the audible voice of God from heaven. David Whitmer, who lived well past all of the other witnesses into 1888, and whom Richard Anderson calls, not coincidentally, the most interviewed witness, described the atmosphere in which all this occurred. All at once, a light came down from above us and encircled us for quite a little distance around, and the angel stood before us. We were overshadowed by a light. It was not like the light of the sun, nor like that of a fire, but more glorious and beautiful. It extended away around us, I cannot tell how far. All of a sudden, I beheld a dazzlingly brilliant light that surpassed in brightness even the sun at noonday, and which seemed to envelop the woods for a considerable distance around. Simultaneous with the light came a strange, entrancing influence, which permeated me so powerfully that I felt chained to the spot, while I also experienced a sensation of joy absolutely indescribable. I beheld the glory of the Lord. Simple, ordinary, mundane forgery, the work, say, of a cunning and conniving blacksmith, can't account for such claims. It can't create an unearthly light, let alone produce an apparent angel or a divine voice from heaven. Moreover, as Richard L. Anderson points out, those who see the witnesses as victims of simple deception have overlooked the complexity of the experience promised to them, and their later spontaneous mention of seeing the other ancient objects with the plates. Consider, for instance, the words spoken to the three witnesses in a June 1829 revelation given just prior to their experience with the angel and the plates. "Behold, I say unto you that you must rely upon my word, which if you do with full purpose of heart, you shall have a view of the plates, and also of the breastplate, the sword of Laban, the Urim and Thummim, which were given to the brother of Jared upon the mount, when he talked with the Lord face to face, and the miraculous directors, which were given to Lehi while in the wilderness on the borders of the Red Sea. And it is by your faith that you shall obtain a view of them, even by that faith which was had by the prophets of old. And after that you have obtained faith, and have seen them with your eyes, you shall testify of them by the power of God. And this you shall do, that my servant Joseph Smith Jr. may not be destroyed, that I may bring about my righteous purposes unto the children of men in this work." And in fact, even though the official statement doesn't mention it, they did see all of those things. David Whitmer, for example, said in various interviews that the angel showed unto us the plates, the sword of Laban, the directors, that is the Liahona, the Urim and Thummim, and other records. There appeared as it were a table with many records on it. Besides the plates of the Book of Mormon, also the sword of Laban, the directors and the interpreters. I saw them as plain as I see this bed, striking his hand upon the bed beside him. I saw the interpreters in the holy vision. They looked like whitish stones put in the rim of a bow, looked like spectacles, only much larger. There was, in other words, a collection, an ensemble of concrete and tangible objects in their experience, not just the plates, not just the angel in the plates. Richard Anderson's comment is appropriate here. Nothing short of biblical Christianity furnishes such a concrete statement of supernatural reality. One cannot dismiss the experience easily, for each man so testifying impressed his community with his capacity and unwavering honesty, and all three consistently reaffirmed the experience in hundreds of interviews throughout their lives. We now turn to the 8 witnesses, whose experience was very different, and their official statement reflects that difference. It is, among other things, far more restrained, matter-of-fact, even legalistic, than the statement of the 3. For instance, in their threefold reference to Joseph Smith as the said Smith. Notice, too, their almost non-committal language. They will not go beyond what they saw and what their eyes and their hands had been able to verify. They saw the plates, which they said had the appearance of gold. They saw the engravings on those plates, which they said had the appearance of ancient work and of curious workmanship. They don't claim to have seen the Leahona, the directors, or the sword of Laban, or the breastplate or the Urim and Thummim, the interpreters, or any library collection of other metal plates. No audible divine voice is heard. They receive no heavenly confirmation that the translation is correct. No unearthly light is reported. No entrancing influence. No sensation of transcending joy. No angel appears to them. They don't testify to divine power in the translation process. They simply bear witness that they know of a surety that the said Smith has got the plates. They have handled those plates, leaf by leaf, with their hands. They have seen and hefted the plates. The verb to heft is worth noting. It's significant. It means to lift or to carry, with the clear connotation that what is being lifted or carried is something heavy. We don't heft goldfish or feathers or tufts of cotton. It is in fact scarcely surprising that the verb contains such a suggestion, since we also use heft as a noun to indicate notable weight. At one point, before he saw the plates and the angels, for example, Martin Harris had a chance to lift the box that purportedly contained the plates. His recollection of that test has always struck me as hilarious, whether the humor was intentional or not. But please note the word that he uses. I knew from the heft that they were lead or gold, and I knew that Joseph had not credit enough to buy so much lead. But let's get back to the 8 witnesses and their declaration that they had seen, hefted, and handled. With these simple claims, Richard Anderson remarks, 8 farmers and artisans publicly reported that Joseph Smith had shown them ancient plates of the Book of Mormon. A practical group who worked with their hands, they were better able to evaluate the appearance of gold and the curious workmanship than 8 picked at random from a modern city. These farmers and artisans were, again, members of a jury of peers, ordinary common men. There were many very like them on the American frontier in the early 19th century, with Joseph Smith himself and the 3 witnesses, 12 good men and true. But the 8 witnesses can't simply be added to the 3 for a total of 11 supplemental confirming witnesses for Joseph. That would be true, but inadequate. They aren't interchangeable. They're not fungible. Their testimony is very different, and I think designedly so, from that of the 3. The great B.H. Roberts set out some vitally important analysis of the 2 sets of witnesses in his classic 1930 Comprehensive History of the Church. I can really do no better, I think, than to quote it all at considerable, even awkward length. Members of the church will profit, in my judgment, from familiarity with his thinking on this issue. Now quoting B.H. Roberts, "It is to be observed that what may be called 2 kinds of testimony to the truth of the Book of Mormon are found in the statements of the 3 and 8 witnesses, respectively. That is, what men would call miraculous testimony and ordinary testimony. Had there been but one kind of testimony, the matter would have been much simplified for the objector. Had the testimony of the 3 witnesses been the only kind given, that is, if the plates had been exhibited to the 8 witnesses in the same manner as they had been revealed to the 3, then perhaps mental hallucination might have been urged with more show of reason. Or if the 3 witnesses had seen the plates in the same manner as the 8 did, in a plain, matter-of-fact way without display of divine power, then the theory of pure fabrication, with collusion on the part of all those who assisted in bringing forth the work, would have more standing. But with the 2 kinds of testimony to deal with, it is extremely difficult for objectors to dispose of the matter. It is just at this point that the 2 kinds of testimony, the testimony of the 3 witnesses and the 8 respectively, act and react upon each other in a manner quite remarkable. The mental mirage theory might offer a possible solution for the vision of the 3 witnesses, but what of the testimony of the 8 witnesses, also plain, matter-of-fact, straightforward, and real? How shall that be accounted for? Here, all the miraculous is absent. It is a man-to-man transaction. Neither superstition nor expectation of the supernatural can play any part in working up an illusion or mental mirage respecting what the 8 witnesses saw and handled. Their testimony must be accounted for on some other hypothesis than that of hallucination. And indeed it is. Some regard it as a mere fabrication of interested parties to the general scheme of deception. This, however, is an arbitrary proceeding, not warranted by a just treatment of the facts involved. Others, being impressed with the evident honesty of the witnesses, or not being able to account for the matter in any other way, admit that Joseph Smith must have had plates which he exhibited to the 8 witnesses, but deceived them as to the manner in which he came in possession of them. The net result, then, of the anti-Mormon speculations in relation to the testimony of the 3 witnesses and the 8 is the theory of hallucination to account for the testimony of the 3 witnesses, and pure fabrication, with the possibility of deception by Joseph Smith as to the existence of some kind of plates lurking in the background, to account for the testimony of the 8 witnesses. But the testimony of the 3 and the 8 witnesses respectively stands or falls together. If the pure fabrication theory is adopted to explain away the testimony of the 8 witnesses, there's no reason why it should not be adopted to explain away the testimony of the 3. But every circumstance connected with the testimony of all these witnesses cries out against the theory of pure fabrication. It is in recognition of the evident honesty of the 3 witnesses that the theory of mental hallucination is invented to account for their testimony, as it is also the evident honesty of the 8 witnesses that leads to the admission by many anti-Mormon writers that Joseph Smith must have had some kind of plates which he exhibited to the 8 witnesses, though he may not have obtained them through supernatural means. Perhaps I can rephrase Elder Roberts' point. Let's assume for a moment that the experience of the 3 witnesses, miraculous testimony as he calls it, can be explained as the product of hallucination. I think that it absolutely cannot be, but let's assume it for purposes of the argument. The very distinct experience of the 8 witnesses, ordinary testimony in Elder Roberts' terminology, cannot plausibly be accounted for by hallucination. It's too mundane, matter of fact. So perhaps a critic might urge it was a matter of a cunningly designed stage prop, fake plates created to fool the yokels, something out of tin maybe. But who manufactured those plates, those golden plates? What was the source of the considerable gold required to make them, and where did it go? Why were the Smiths still poor after the plates disappeared? And anyway, mere stage prop plates can't explain the experience of the 3. Let me sum up the point that I'm trying to make by flatly asserting that with the testimonies of the 3 and the 8 witnesses, we don't simply have an arithmetic sum of 2 collective testimonies. Rather, in my judgment, given the different nature of the reported experiences, the difficulty for those who want to dismiss the claims of the witnesses is increased geometrically, not merely arithmetically, by the existence of the 2 kinds of witness. Put crudely, the critic's difficulty isn't just doubled, it's quadrupled. But there's more. We now come to the informal or unofficial witnesses. Late in his life, William Smith, the prophet's younger brother, described what happened when Joseph entered the home with the plates from which the Book of Mormon would soon be translated. When the plates were brought in, they were wrapped in a tow frock. My father then put them into a pillowcase. We handled them and could tell what they were. They were not quite as large as this Bible. I could tell whether they were round or square, could raise the leaves this way, raising a few leaves of the Bible before him. One could easily tell that they were not a stone hewn out to deceive, or even a block of wood. Being a mixture of gold and copper, they were much heavier than stone and very much heavier than wood. Martin Harris estimated the weight of the plates at somewhere between 40 pounds and 60 pounds. William Smith's estimate was roughly similar, though on the high end of Martin's range. I did not see them uncovered, he says, but I handled them and hefted them while wrapped in a tow frock and judged them to have weighed about 60 pounds. I could tell they were plates of some kind, that they were fastened together by rings running through the back. Please note again that verb, to heft. William Smith was a witness to the Book of Mormon. Perhaps the first person outside the Smith family to feel and heft the plates, that is, even before the 8 witnesses, was Josiah Stowell, for whom the very young Joseph Smith sometimes worked as a hired hand. During Joseph Smith's 30 June 1830 trial for an alleged breach of the peace in Broome County, New York, Stowell actually testified under oath that he saw the plates the day Joseph first brought them home, as Joseph passed them through the window. Stowell caught a glimpse of the plates as a portion of the linen was pulled back. Stowell gave the court the dimensions of the plates and explained that they consisted of gold leaves with characters written on each sheet. Josiah Stowell was a witness to the Book of Mormon. Lucy Harris is typically remembered among Latter-day Saints very negatively for her opposition to her husband Martin's involvement with the Book of Mormon, and most dramatically as the leading suspect in the case of the lost 116 pages. The story is a bit more complicated than that, however. Lucy Mack Smith recalled that early in the process of recovering the Book of Mormon, Lucy Harris offered to help Joseph publish it. But, quote, only if I can get a witness that you do speak the truth, end quote. Joseph reminded her that only God can bestow such a witness, and Mrs. Harris went away, quote, highly displeased, end quote. But Lucy Smith's narrative goes on to recount that on the very next day, Mrs. Harris returned with a very different attitude. She said that a personage had appeared to her during the previous night who told her that inasmuch as she had disputed the servant of the Lord and said that his word was not to be believed and asked him many improper questions, that she had done that which was not right in the sight of God. After which he said, behold, here are the plates, look upon them and believe. She then described the record very minutely. Lucy Harris gave Joseph $28, worth $760 in 2020. Which appears to make her the very first donor toward the publication of the Book of Mormon. Unexpectedly, Lucy Harris was a witness. Lucy Mack Smith herself, the prophet's mother, claimed to have examined the Urim and Thummim and found that it consisted of 2 smooth 3-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glasses were set in silver bows, which were connected with each other in much the same way as old-fashioned spectacles. She also encountered the breastplate. It was, she said, wrapped in a thin muslin handkerchief, so thin that I could see the glistening metal and ascertain its proportions without any difficulty. It was concave on one side and convex on the other, and extended from the neck downwards as far as the center of the stomach of a man of extraordinary size. It had 4 straps of the same material for the purpose of fastening it to the breast, 2 of which ran back to go over the shoulders, and the other 2 were designed to fasten to the hips. They were just the width of 2 of my fingers, for I measured them, and they had holes in the ends of them to be convenient in fastening. On the 26th of August, 1838, an Ohio woman named Sally Parker wrote a letter to one John Kempton. The letter has survived, and in it she describes Lucy Mack Smith, the mother of the prophet. I lived by his mother, and she was one of the finest of women, always helping them that stood in need. She told me the whole story. I asked her if she saw the plates. She said no, it was not for her to see them, but she hefted and handled them, and I believed all she said, for I lived by her 8 months, and she was one of the best of women. Now, please note that she claimed to have hefted the plates. Lucy Mack Smith was a witness. Emma Smith, too, can be considered a corroborating witness to the plates. I moved them from place to place on the table, as it was necessary in doing my housework. At times she had to lift and move the covered plates when she swept and dusted. Here's a portion of an interview with her that was conducted by her son Joseph III, not very long before her death on the 30th of April, 1879. Question: are you sure that he had the plates at the time you were writing for him? Answer: the plates often lay on the table without any attempt at concealment, wrapped in a small linen tablecloth, which I had given him to fold them in. I once felt of the plates as they thus lay on the table, tracing their outline and shape. They seemed to be pliable like thick paper, and would rustle with a metallic sound when the edges were moved by a thumb, as one does sometimes thumb the edges of a book. Emma Smith was a witness to the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith's sister Catherine held and even carried the covered plates on several different occasions. She seems often to have emphasized what Chris Heimerdinger calls their physicality. Herbert S. Salisbury, grandson of the prophet's sister Catherine, recalled his grandmother telling him about Joseph's first bringing the plates home. She said he entered the house running and threw himself on a couch, panting from his extraordinary exertion. She told me Joseph allowed her to heft the package, but not to see the gold plates, as the angel had forbidden him to show them at that period. She said they were very heavy. Note yet again that verb to heft. Catherine remembered Joseph's arrival home in 1827 when she was 14, and that the plates were wrapped up in his frock. When he got to the door, he said, "Father, I've been followed. Look and see if you can see anyone." He then threw himself on the bed and fainted. When he came to, he told us the circumstances. He had his thumb put out of place, and his arm was very lame. Her grandson, Herbert Salisbury, remembered his grandmother, relating that when Joseph came in the house, he was completely out of breath. She, Catherine, took the plates from him and laid them on the table temporarily and helped to revive him till he got breathing properly, and also examined his hand and treated it for the bruises on his knuckles. He had been chased by members of a mob. In striking the last one, he dislocated his thumb, which, however, he did not notice until he came within sight of the house, when he threw himself down in the corner of the fence in order to recover his breath. As soon as he was able, he arose and came to the house. He was still altogether speechless from fright and the fatigue of running. Mary Salisbury Hancock, Catherine's granddaughter, remembered Catherine relating that same episode, or a similar one, when Joseph, with the plates in his possession, had been chased by a mob. Hearing an unusual commotion outside, Catherine flew to the door and threw it open just as Joseph came rushing up, panting for breath. He thrust a bundle into her arms and in a gasping voice whispered hoarsely, "Take these quickly and hide them." Then he disappeared into the darkness. Closing the door, Catherine ran hurriedly to the bedroom where she and Sophronia slept. Sophronia threw back the bedding, and Catherine put the bundle on the bed, quickly replacing the bedding. Both of them lay down on the bed and pretended sleep. The mob, failing to find Joseph outside, returned to the house to search, but they did not disturb the girls since they appeared to be sleeping. Catherine Smith was a witness to the Book of Mormon. David Whitmer, one of the three witnesses, related that his mother, Mary Musselman Whitmer, saw the plates quite independently of anybody else and under the most matter-of-fact circumstances. The entire family of Peter Whitmer Sr. had become acquainted with Joseph Smith in 1828 through David, the fourth of 9 children. Eventually, a substantial part of the translation of the Book of Mormon occurred at the Peter Whitmer farm near Fayette, New York. Later, on April 6, 1830, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would be formally organized there. During that period, the place was a hive of activity. Joseph Smith and his wife Emma and Oliver Cowdery were boarding with the Whitmers, and other people, including curiosity seekers, were constantly coming and going. Much of the burden of coping with them fell upon Peter's wife, Mary. "My father and mother had a large family of their own," David later explained. "The addition to it, therefore, of Joseph, his wife Emma, and Oliver very greatly increased the toil and anxiety of my mother, and although she had never complained, she had sometimes felt that her labor was too much, or at least she was perhaps beginning to feel so." A granddaughter's account, published by Royal Skousen, an interpreter, adds specific human detail to the story, relating that Mary Whitmer was irritated when Joseph and Oliver took breaks from translating and skated rocks on a pond. She thought they might just as well carry her a bucket of water or chop a bit of wood, and she was about to order them from our house. The most interesting aspect of this story is that Mary Whitmer's difficulty with the household situation was more than just being tired from all the extra work. She was irritated by Joseph and Oliver's indifference to all the work she was doing, with their not helping out and instead skipping rocks for relaxation, so she was about to order them out of her house. Thus, Moroni's intervention was perhaps more purposeful than we might previously have thought. Undoubtedly, many others exerted a great deal of effort on behalf of providing help to Joseph and Oliver, such as Emma Smith had just done in Harmony, Pennsylvania, for the previous 3 months. Here, however, Moroni needed to deal with a more difficult situation, one that could have forced Joseph to find another place, and a secure one, to do the translating. Moroni and the Lord weren't in the habit of just showing the plates to people to encourage them to act as a support team for the work of the translation. One day, though, probably in June 1829, she was going out to milk the cows in the family barn, where David happened to know the plates were concealed at the time. She met an old man, as she described him, who said to her, in David's account of the story, "You have been very faithful and diligent in your labors, but you're tired because of the increase of your toil. It is proper, therefore, that you should receive a witness, that your faith may be strengthened." Thereupon, David said, he showed her the plates, and this unexpected encounter completely removed her feeling of being overwhelmed, said her son, and nerved her up for her increased responsibilities. Afterwards, Mary was able to describe the plates in detail. John C. Whitmer, her grandson, reported that he himself had independently heard his grandmother tell of this event several times. He summarized her experience in more detailed fashion as follows. She met a stranger carrying something on his back that looked like a knapsack. At first she was a little afraid of him, but when he spoke to her in a kind, friendly tone and began to explain to her the nature of the work which was going on in her house, that is, the translation of the Book of Mormon, she was filled with unexpressible joy and satisfaction. He then untied his knapsack and showed her a bundle of plates, which in size and appearance corresponded with the descriptions subsequently given by the witnesses to the Book of Mormon. This strange person turned the leaves of the Book of Plates over, leaf after leaf, and also showed her the engravings upon them, after which he told her to be patient and faithful in bearing her burden a little longer, promising that if she would do so, she should be blessed, and her reward would be sure, if she proved faithful to the end. The personage then suddenly vanished with the plates, and where he went, she could not tell. From that moment, my grandmother was enabled to perform her household duties with comparative ease, and she felt no more inclination to murmur because her lot was hard. I knew my grandmother to be a good, noble, and truthful woman, and I have not the least doubt of her statement in regard to seeing the plates being strictly true. 5 of Mary Whitmer's sons and a son-in-law became official witnesses of the Book of Mormon. Hiram Page, one of the 8 witnesses, had married Catherine Whitmer in 1825. Oliver Cowdery, one of the 3 witnesses and the principal scribe during its dictation, baptized Mary Whitmer into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Seneca Lake on April 18, 1830, when the church was less than 2 weeks old, and he married her daughter, Elizabeth Ann, in December 1832. The Whitmers gathered to Missouri with the Latter-day Saints, and there Mary died at 78 years of age in 1856, still a faithful believer in the divine origin of the gold plates and the book that had been translated from them. She was a witness. So what special significance, if any, do the experiences of the informal or unofficial witnesses hold? First of all, as Richard Anderson points out, these private encounters with the metal book preceded both the 3 witnesses seeing the angel in the plates and also the 8 witnesses handling the plates in natural surroundings. Interestingly, too, these informal witnesses reported a mixture of the same kinds of experiences, more or less, that the 3 and the 8 had. In B.H. Roberts' language, they received both ordinary testimony and miraculous testimony. William Smith, Josiah Stowell, the early Martin Harris, Lucy Mack Smith, Emma Smith, and Catherine Smith had quite mundane encounters with tangible physical objects, much like the 8 witnesses. Lucy Harris and Mary Musselman Whitmer saw the plates, but also an angel or messenger, rather like the 3 witnesses. So they provide additional corroborating testimony, but I think that they offer more than just that. Again, the informal or unofficial witnesses are not interchangeable, not with each other as individuals, nor collectively with the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses. Several arguments that have been deployed against the 3 and the 8, however ineffectually, just can't be used against the informal witnesses. Some skeptics have suggested, for instance, that some sort of social dynamic or collective group hysteria explains the experience of the 3 and the 8, but the informal witnesses had their experiences separately, so collective emotional pressure can't seem to account for them. Others have suggested that the 3 and the 8 went out expecting to have a spiritual experience, and so being effectively programmed for something extraordinary to happen, they did have remarkable experiences, but experiences that were real only in a subjective sense. This doesn't seem a very plausible or persuasive objection to me, but it certainly doesn't apply to the unofficial witnesses. Mary Whitmer was in the barn milking cows, perhaps feeling a bit sulky and resentful. She wasn't expecting an encounter with the plates and the messenger, so religious fervor can't explain her report in any obvious or straightforward way. Josiah Stowell and Catherine Smith suddenly had a heavy object thrust at them under rather tense conditions. Lucy Mack Smith and Martin Harris and Emma Hale Smith and William Smith were just handling and examining tangible objects under very mundane circumstances. Here's something else to note with regard to most of the informal witnesses whom I've discussed here. With Joseph Smith, the 3 and the 8 constitute a kind of jury of 12 good men and true, in terms comprehensible to their culture and in accord with its expectations for deciding important matters. As I explained during my 2019 Fair Mormon remarks, women weren't permitted to serve as jurors in the 1820s or 1830s, nor indeed for many years thereafter. But the Lord called Lucy Mack Smith, Emma Smith, Catherine Smith, Mary Whitmer, and even Lucy Harris to serve as witnesses beyond those 12 good men and true. The voices of these women, their testimonies, deserve to be heard now, right along with those of the men, and we owe it to them to help that happen. Traveling on his way to a mission in England in 1853, David B. Dill stopped by the Martin Harris home in Kirtland, Ohio. The 70-year-old witness was in bed at the time, so sick that he hadn't eaten in 3 days. But when Elder Dill showed up, he bore spirited testimony of his experience with the angel and the plates. Moreover, reminiscent of several other accounts that tell how even when he was ill or very old, he became energized when testifying. He got out of bed, dressed himself, asked for food, spoke with Elder Dill for hours, and went to hear him preach that evening. Afterwards, he said to Elder Dill, "Just let me go with you to England. You do the preaching, and I'll bear testimony to the Book of Mormon, and we will convert all England." In the last year of Martin's life, John E. Godfrey visited him. "I'm pleased to have you come," said the now nearly 92-year-old witness, "and I wish I could bear my testimony to the whole world. I tell you of these things," he told his bishop just a few days before his death, "that you may tell others that what I have said is true, and I dare not deny it. I heard the voice of God commanding me to testify to the same."
It's very compelling to me that so many people witnessed of the reality of both the gold plates themselves, as well as to the authenticity of the translation process. This final fair talk I wanted to highlight goes through the logic tree of the Book of Mormon, and I find myself agreeing with the logic presented here.
These are the logical options as I see them. That Joseph either had plates or he didn't have plates. And then there are subdivisions that you can follow through to see possible ways in which each of these might be the case. I remember my friend Bill Hamblin once being in communication with a one-time fairly prominent ex-member, critic of the church, of the Book of Mormon. And he said, "Look, let's assume for a moment that you're right and that Joseph Smith did not have plates. Did he know that he didn't have plates, or did he think that he had the plates? In other words, was he a conscious deceiver, or was he in some sense mad?" To which this critic responded, "I don't have to lower myself to your simplistic little dichotomies." Well, see, I think it's intellectually incumbent upon people like that to, come on, give us an answer to this. Otherwise, it's like guerrilla warfare. You attack and attack and attack, but you always withdraw. You never defend territory. You never have to stake out your own explanation, which then will be subject to criticism and attack. Well, to me, that simple-minded little dichotomy that this person refused to give an answer to, or refused to take part in, is still a really important question. If Joseph Smith didn't have the plates, did he know that he didn't have plates, or did he think that he did? Okay, so let's look a little more in detail. Joseph had no plates. This is what most critics say. There were none, all right? The first option is that he knew that he had no plates. Okay, now, this runs into a number of issues. You have to ask, first of all, was this deliberate? Was it cynical, or was it pious? Was he a cynical fraud? Just a con artist? 19th century con man. Okay. I think you run into issues right there, and one of the places you run into issues is with Joseph Smith's writings, which are now being published, the personal writings of Joseph Smith, the Joseph Smith Papers. If Joseph Smith is not sincere, then I can't judge sincerity in another human being. This is a man who, in his most personal private writings, letters to his wife, personal journal entries, they're full of prayers. He's praying all the time, "Oh Lord, help your servant, help me." Writing to his wife Emma, praying, expressing prayers for her. telling his children to be sure they say their prayers at night, this sort of thing. All the time coming across as a believer. There's nothing at all in the early Joseph Smith that you could say points to someone who's a cynical, manipulative deceiver. It's just not there. He doesn't let the mask fall at all. If he is one, there's no evidence for it that I can see. Now, I know some people will come back and they'll say, well, what about plural marriage later on? Well, that's a difficult case, and we can argue that. I'm willing to argue that. I don't want to do it here. That's quite far afield. But I'm talking about the early Joseph Smith. I don't think you see the cynical deceiver anywhere in Joseph's character, but you certainly don't see it in 1828. You don't see it in 1830. This is a young man. I mean, you even have descriptions of him going out into the woods to pray, just as he says he did with the first vision. This was a habit of his. He would go out into the woods to pray when he was concerned about something, when he was worried, when he was upset or indecisive and so on. There's a continual pattern of this kind of thing. He is a believer. If you can see anything from the writings that are coming out, he really believes that he's receiving revelations. He's not a cynical con artist. And there's other evidence. Would a cynical con artist have put up with some of the stuff he endured? Think of Liberty Jail. If you've ever been in Liberty Jail, you know how small that area was and how grim and dark it was. I had the occasion, the privilege, a couple of years ago, I guess, to go back and speak in Liberty Jail. I never thought I'd have that chance. It was for the anniversary of the building of the Visitors Center, I think. And I stood actually above the space in which Joseph Smith was confined. And what really worried me was I noticed they'd put the podium in such a place that I was standing on the trap door. And I just wondered, if the talk goes on too long or they don't like it, does it just open up and whoosh, I'm down there with Joseph and Sidney. But he was genuinely miserable. I think you have to understand that he came close to despair. You can imagine what it must have been like for him there. When he's writing this epistle, the famous epistle in section 121, O Lord, where art thou? I don't think you should see that as just literary flourish or play acting. He really is feeling abandoned. This is a terrible time for him. And it's made all the more terrible by the fact that, I've got ahead of myself, by the fact that the saints are being driven out and he's not able to do anything about it. Can you imagine? If you had any trace of human conscience at all, if you were lying, this would be almost impossible to endure. And he would reach his absolute low point, but he comes through it faith intact, as does his brother Hiram, one of the witnesses, so on and so forth. Think of what else happened to the saints because of his claims. Can you imagine again, if you were just making up a story and there are people literally dying for you, for the story you're telling? Gosh, he'd have to be a sociopath to be able to put up with that. But there's, again, no evidence that he was anything of the kind. And then, of course, there's his own ultimate martyrdom. He actually thought he was going to die at liberty, but he did die just a few years later. And he pretty well knew that was going to be the end result. Richard Anderson published an article years ago, which didn't get wide circulation, showing Joseph's awareness of the fact that after about 1838, 1839, that he was going to die fairly shortly. That there had been a kind of divine protection over him, but he sensed that had been, or would be shortly, removed, that his work was drawing to its end. Now, it's easy to sit here and say, a con artist might go through with it all to the end, but not many would. Again, this argues for sincerity rather than cynicism and conscious deceit. He does actually die there, and he dies faithful to his testimony. So does Hiram Smith, and that's striking to me, that Hiram, the elder brother, accompanies him to Carthage jail. And of course, there's also the evidence that even if you decided Joseph is a conscious deceiver, there are other people who are seeing things with him. Most of his revelatory experiences are shared. After the first vision, over and over and over again, there are other people there who see things, heft things with him. So the cynical deception thing just doesn't cut it. It doesn't do it. Here's one of my favorite stories, and that's Mary Musselman Whitmer, who was one of the witnesses to the plates, the 13th witness, the 12th or 13th witness she's been called. And her story is a remarkable one. We have at least two chains of accounts telling about her experience of having seen the plates, which he didn't expect to do. And it was under very prosaic circumstances. Some people have told me, and I've mentioned this here before, oh yeah, the witnesses were just in some sort of religious ecstasy, right? They hallucinated this. She's milking the cows. And I didn't grow up on a farm, but my father did. And he told me that milking cows was not a mystical experience for him. In fact, I just mentioned, my father was convinced, he grew up in a Lutheran family in North Dakota. He was convinced that he was going to hell because he said, you couldn't milk cows without swearing. Because just as you got the milk pail filled, the cow would stick its filthy hoof in the milk, or the cow would hit you in the face with its filthy tail. He said, you could, and he would spend time sometimes with his city cousins, and he said, they're going to heaven because they don't have to milk cows. And I'm going to hell because I do. It's not fair. It raises the problem of divine justice and the problem of evil in a really acute form. You know, if you've been raised on a farm, you have to put up with that. She's out there milking the cows, and she's not in a good mood because the menfolk are in there translating the Book of Mormon. And she's having to do all the work and feed them. So she's not feeling especially spiritual. That's when the messenger comes and says, look, you're having a hard time, right? It's only fair that you get a special look at these plates so you'll feel better about things. And she did. She felt considerably better. But again, how would Joseph Smith, the cynical deceiver, explain that? Then you've got to bring in something else. All these people are hallucinating, right? Mary Whitmer, while milking the cows, hallucinates the plates. I mean, it's possible, but good grief, it strains credulity just a little bit. Okay, so here's another possibility. He wasn't a cynical fraud, but he was a fraud nonetheless. He was a pious fraud. Now, this is a little harder to deal with because the evidence for his sincerity and piety are all over the place. But still, nevertheless, maybe he had no plates. He just somehow convinced a bunch of other people that he did. But that's, again, really hard to trust or to take seriously because too many other people see these things. Now, I've gotten lectures within the past few days on the weaknesses of eyewitness testimony. And it's true, sometimes eyewitness testimony is weak. For example, if somebody comes to you, you open the door and the person pulls a gun on you. Later on, you may not be able to remember what color his shirt was because you're kind of focused on the gun that's aimed at your face. So eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. But for things like this, we have multiple people saying we saw, and it took a considerable amount of time. In some cases, in the case of the 8, we hefted, we felt this in these plates. It seems to me you're really, really pushing it to say, well, eyewitness testimony just isn't reliable. In fact, I offered in a discussion I had the other day, I said, look, I'm just going to come over with a sledgehammer and demolish your car. You can come out and watch. And my defense will be, eyewitness testimony is unreliable. How does he know he actually saw that? It's notoriously unreliable. So even though I stood there for 20 minutes with a sledgehammer and pounded his car in, that doesn't count for anything. We take eyewitness testimony seriously all the time unless we have strong reason to reject it. My argument is these people do have strong reason to reject it, but it's not a good reason. They just don't want to believe it. So these witnesses, alone among witnesses who have experiences with hefty material objects and so on, they become totally unreliable, not worth taking seriously at all. So the pious fraud thing doesn't work. Pious he was, but the fraudulent thing, that he had no plates and knew that he had no plates, doesn't stand up for those reasons and others. You have to get in a Simpsons reference. I think my children were educated more by the Simpsons than by school. So there you have the pious fraud, or another one. But maybe he thought he had plates. Maybe he was nuts. Maybe in some sense he was a dissociative personality. He didn't know what was real around him and so on. Well, where is the evidence for that? Joseph seems to be pretty much in touch with reality. But even so, again, you run into problems. Suppose you say, all right, Joseph was hallucinating the plates. What about all the other people? Did he really manage to find the 8 local yokels who would also hallucinate plates just in time? I mean, I don't know how you even pull this off. You've got the 8 witnesses, you've got the 3, you've got multiple other witnesses. I've mentioned before, some of my favorites are the people who spend time with the plates when Joseph isn't around. Emma and his sister Catherine feeling the plates, feeling the D-shaped rings that hold them together, ruffling along the edges, and having the top plate scrape across the one below. Again, you can say all you want. Joseph thought he had plates, he was just mentally ill, but then you've got a whole bunch of other people, and they seem to be densely concentrated around the area where Joseph lives. Something in the water, that they all imagine plates, all at the same time. It's remarkable. I mean, that's almost a sign of divine intervention right there, that you'd have such luck to find so many crazy people so densely concentrated and available to him. All right, so the alternative is Joseph had plates. He didn't have no plates, he had plates. And here are the possibilities as I see them. Maybe he made them. Well, all right. Yeah, he made them. All right, now you have to come up with evidence that Joseph was able to make plates. What evidence is there that he was a metallurgist or a blacksmith or anything of the kind that he could make plates? Well, there is no evidence, and so there was a time when people were arguing that it was actually Oliver Cowdery who had blacksmithing experience. Now, if you've read Longfellow's old poem about the blacksmith with broad and sinewy arms and his mighty massive chest and all this sort of thing, that's not Oliver Cowdery. He was a very slight man, and he died very young of something like tuberculosis. He was not a powerful, muscled guy, and there is no evidence whatsoever that he was a blacksmith. But trying to invoke him as a blacksmith is already an admission that Joseph Smith making the plates doesn't really work. It doesn't really hold up. Now, there are people who've still suggested it. Dan Vogel has suggested it recently, that Joseph just, or relatively recently, and a lot of people have picked up on this. There's no evidence for it. Where do you get that much gold? Do you realize how much gold that would be? And we're talking about thousands and thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of gold in today's prices. I don't know what gold is today, I haven't looked. But the plates are generally estimated at about 60 pounds, even if they're gold alloy. That's a lot of gold. How many of you have that? And then it disappears, right? The family had this enormously valuable artifact, and then they lost it or something, and they continue to live in poverty. It's really rather strange. Where'd the Smiths get the money to get that much gold? There's a line from Martin Harris that I've quoted before, I really enjoy it, where at one point before he's an official witness, Martin actually sits with the little wooden box that the plates were in on his lap. And he was struck by how heavy it was, because it was heavier than a rock would have been, or if it had been filled with dirt. You know how gold is unusually heavy, gold and lead both. And so Martin Harris's remark afterwards is that it was heavy enough that he knew it had to be either gold or lead, and he knew that Joseph had not enough credit to buy so much lead. I don't know if he meant that to be funny or not, but I think it's funny. Because, well, if it's not lead, then obviously Joseph went out and got the cheaper stuff, gold. But he has a material object of considerable heft. And it's difficult to explain that, and it's difficult to imagine that he made plates that would gull the yokels. You have to imagine this. Again, I go back to Jeff Lindsay, who I think it's Jeff Lindsay, or maybe I've written on this, I can't remember. Maybe I'm losing my mind. But the idea that you have this sort of specialty forge to the south of Palmyra where gold is coming in pound after pound after pound, and Joseph and Oliver are there pounding out these plates and creating, remember there are other artifacts, the Liahona, the breastplate, the sword of Laban, all this sort of stuff. They're absolutely first-rate metalworkers. And nobody in Palmyra notices the smoke belching out of this place and the daily deliveries of gold ore. That's a little strange. There were no secrets in a place like that, and so it's hard to imagine that. So both the cynical fraud and the pious fraud sort of go out of the way there, and the evidence that he made them is nil. So what about he received them from somebody else? Well, two possibilities. He received them from a contemporary or from a non-contemporary. Now, Years ago, I had a fellow who was arguing for a thesis of an unknown conspiracy that had created the plates and the Book of Mormon, rather, not the plates. He didn't think there were any plates. But this group had created the Book of Mormon at some time. I asked him if he could specify the time. No, he couldn't. Could have been any time within the previous 300 years. Was there any particular place that they'd done it? No, didn't know that. I said, well, of course you don't, because there's no evidence for this. You're just making this up. I called them the Illuminati because it's the idea that there is a conspiracy out there that is so secret that there's no evidence for it at all. We don't know who they are. We don't know when they did it. We don't know why they did it. We don't know how they did it, why they chose Joseph Smith. Nothing. You just assume they're out there. This is a case of being thesis-driven to the point of absurdity, that you need somebody else to do it because you know Joseph Smith didn't do it, so some mythical person did it, or persons. How many? He didn't know. Anyway, it to me is on the level of Harvey the Invisible Rabbit. Although in Harvey it turned out there was one. I'm not expecting to find the Illuminati anytime soon. So there's no evidence for contemporaries. We just don't have any evidence for the plates coming from anybody else. Maybe you received them from a non-contemporary. Well, I have a candidate. And what I would argue here, is I'm just kind of going through this very rapidly, but I would argue that I put this last because I think every other avenue has been blocked off. You can't do it. And so it leaves you with the one explanation that's still out there. Now, I know for some people this is impossible too. But you may remember the line from Sherlock Holmes where he explained his method of deduction, which was simply you have to eliminate all the things that are impossible, and whatever you're left with, however improbable, must be the explanation. Now, there are people out there saying, no, you don't get books from angels, to quote Sterling McMurrin. He already had a predetermined dogmatic position, so it couldn't be that way. Or what's his name? Morgan. Dale Morgan. I was thinking Dale Morgan, who said, look, I can accept any explanation except the one the church gives. Well, if that's your position, then fine. This avenue is blocked off for you too, so you have to go with another, like the Illuminati. That will do, because that's more probable if you're absolutely, resolutely opposed to the idea that an angel could have delivered a book to Joseph Smith. That's what you're left with. But for those who allow for what William James called live options, that this could be true, then it seems to me that ultimately, in a sense, people should be forced to this conclusion. Now, I realize there are enough ambiguities out there, I'm oversimplifying, that not everybody will get to this position. But it's the way I get there. It's why I can't take those other avenues. I've said, I can't not believe because, to me, Joseph Smith's story is easier to credit than the explanations that have been proposed to account alternatively for what he claimed.
Like was laid out, I see the question of the Book of Mormon much the same way, that all other explanations for the Book of Mormon are ultimately conjecture with thin to no evidence to back them up, besides the explanation of revelation from God. When it comes down to it, all these arguments and facts are nice to bolster my testimony, but ultimately, I believe the Book of Mormon is the Word of God because I've studied it many times and continue to get answers and assurances from God that it is His Word, and that by studying the Book of Mormon, I have come closer to Christ than from any other book. And if you stuck with me this far, I'd like to end where I started, with the testimony of Elder Holland.
In this I stand with my own great-grandfather, who said simply enough, no wicked man could write such a book as this, and no good man would write it, unless it were true, and he were commanded of God to do so. I testify that one cannot come to full faith in this latter-day work and thereby find the fullest measure of peace and comfort in these our times until he or she embraces the divinity of the Book of Mormon and the Lord Jesus Christ of whom it testifies. If anyone is foolish enough or misled enough to reject 531 pages of a heretofore unknown text teeming with literary and Semitic complexity, without honestly attempting to account for the origin of those pages somehow, especially without accounting for their powerful witness of Jesus Christ and the profound spiritual impact that witness has had on what is now tens of millions of readers. If that's the case, then such persons, elect or otherwise, have been deceived. And if they leave this church, they must do so by crawling over or under or around the Book of Mormon to make their exit. In that sense, the book is what Christ himself was said to be: a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, a barrier in the path of one who wishes not to believe in this work. Witnesses, even witnesses who were for a time hostile to Joseph, testified to their death that they had seen an angel and had handled the plates. Quote, "They have been shown unto us by the power of God and not of man," they declared. "Wherefore we know of a surety that the work is true." Now, I did not sail with the brother of Jared in crossing an ocean and settling in a new world. I did not hear King Benjamin speak his angelically delivered sermon. I did not proselyte with Alma and Amulek, nor witness the fiery death of innocent believers. I was not among the Nephite crowd who touched the wounds of the resurrected Lord, nor did I weep with Mormon and Moroni over the destruction of an entire civilization. But my testimony of this record and the peace it brings to the human heart is as binding and unequivocal as was theirs. Like them, I give my name unto the world, to witness unto the world that which I have seen, and like them, I lie not, God bearing witness of it. I ask that my testimony of the Book of Mormon and all that it implies, given today under my oath and my office, be recorded by men on earth and angels in heaven. I hope I have a few years left in my last days, but whether I do or do not, I want it absolutely clear when I stand before the judgment bar of God that I declared to the world, in the most straightforward language I could summon, that the Book of Mormon is true, that it came forth the way Joseph said it came forth, and was given to bring happiness and hope to the faithful in the travail of the last days. My witness echoes that of Nephi, who wrote part of the book in his last days, and I quote, "Hearken unto these words, and believe in Christ. And if ye believe not in these words, believe in Christ. And if you shall believe in Christ, you shall believe these words, for they are the words of Christ. And they teach all men that they should do good. If they're not the words of Christ, judge ye, for Christ will show you with power and great glory that they are his words at the last day." Brothers and sisters, God always provides safety for the soul, and with the Book of Mormon, he has again done that in our time. Remember this declaration by Jesus himself: "Whoso treasureth up my word shall not be deceived, and in the last days neither your heart nor your faith will fail you. Of this I earnestly testify in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen."
Boy, the faith, the prayers, the hate. years.